How much would you pay for an interview on your dream podcast? $35? $3,500, $10,000. Spoiler, my team and I have seen all of these price points as options for guesting on different podcasts. So the questions we're tackling today are, should you do it? Is it worth it? And what info do you need to gather before you say yes to paying to be a guest on a podcast? Hey there, pitches. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Go Pitch Yourself. I'm your host, Angie Trueblood, and in this episode, we are digging into paying to play, as they call it. That's right, paying to be interviewed on someone else's podcast. If you are new here, welcome. I am a podcast visibility strategist, the founder of the Podwize Group, and fun fact, I'm an experimenter in business. So much so that late last year, we went ahead and bit the bullet, albeit a small one, and paid $97 for one of our clients to be a guest on a podcast so that we could see if there was increased marketing or reach because of that. Stay tuned to hear the results. If you are an OG listener, hello. I'm sure this is an episode that is long overdue, as I have shared about it on socials in the past, and we always get a pretty solid reaction. So hold on to your seats for this one, my friend. I am spilling some insider secrets today. But first, per usual, it is time to share some podcast love. Have you finally gotten to the point where the word hustle makes you roll your eyes because it feels so foreign to how you're able and willing to work, but you're not sure of the alternative? In her podcast, Success with Soul, my friend Kate Kordsmeyer gets to the very root of why hustle mentality does a disservice to you and your business and what you can do instead. As a former freelance journalist who sold her health and wellness blog for multiple six figures, I love how Kate blends online business strategies and soulful marketing advice for entrepreneurs who value relationships, mindfulness, and health just as much as they value strategic action and practical tips. In episode 3 of the Success with Soul podcast, Kate squashes the idea of hustling and instead offers the key components of a sustainable business, including play, creativity, and rest, and how to tap into both the masculine and feminine energies in cycles and seasons. If this approach to business sounds refreshing to you, I highly recommend you hop on over to the Success with Soul podcast, episode 3, Why I Don't Believe in Hustle, and give it a listen. So a little bit behind the scenes on that podcast love segment, Kate Kordsmeyer and I decided to do a podcast promo swap this year. And that was the promo that I recorded to guide you, my wonderful listener, over to her show. She recorded one that she played on her show a couple of weeks ago. And it's just something, again, that we're testing out and seeing if it makes sense to swap audiences and to really get some best practices down for doing it. So sometimes our podcast love of the week will be promo swaps. Sometimes it will be places that I have been interviewed. Other times it will be podcasts that I listen to for fun. You just never know. It is love for podcast nonetheless. Okay, so let's dig into today's topic, paying to be a guest on podcast interviews. Now, candidly, this episode topic has been brewing a bit over the last 5 years, the whole time I've been in business. Randomly, myself or my team will sometimes get an email back from a host that we have pitched, letting us know that there's a media fee or an appearance fee. So basically, in order to move forward with the interview, we must pay. And we have seen the cost range anywhere from $35, that's the lowest, up to 5-figure appearance fees. So Candidly, it does not happen that often, but I do believe we have seen it more commonly over the past 6 months, with even one of the shows that we have previously booked a number of guests on for free, now having switched their model to a pay to be a guest on their show. And then we also tested out a pay-to-play opportunity last year on behalf of one of our clients to see what kind of results the client might get from that. So I'll dig into that for sure. Now, before we dig in, I need you to know I am not opposed to hosts making money. I'm a big advocate of creators and artists getting paid for the work that they are producing. I am a podcast host myself. I enjoy making money. So obviously this is not a dig at podcast hosts figuring out how to monetize their show. There are a couple of parts to this paying to be a guest or charging to have guests on your show that I feel like a lot of hosts could do differently and a little bit more transparently. So we'll tackle the topic from that angle, but I do not want the takeaway to be that hosts should not be charging to have people come on their show as guests. You do you. It is what you have created, and you can monetize it in whatever way you feel suits you and your business goals, and then your audience can decide appropriately. And that really is one of the sticking points, that the audience, in my mind, needs to have all of the information in order to make a judgment call on if they believe in that host and if they continue to listen to that show. We'll dig into that. We're actually approaching this topic on the podcast over 2 different episodes. So today's episode is just me. I'm sharing my perspective, how we handle these opportunities internally, and what I believe that you, as a podcast guest, need to do to evaluate these opportunities when they present themselves to you. Our next episode is an interview with Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and we chat with him around the legalities of this practice, including properly disclosing that financial relationship and even contracts that can help protect both the host and the guest. So that will be the next episode that we release after this one. So let's dig into my perspective on this idea of paying to be a guest on someone's podcast. What are we actually seeing in the market? So for us, the majority of what we see is we will send over a pitch to a podcast host, very well vetted, right? We know it's a show that really tends to serve the type of audience that our client wants to get in front of. We give them a great topic, and then we get an email back that says, Susie sounds like she would be a great guest for our show. As a heads up, there's an XYZ appearance fee, or we've seen it called a production fee, right? Or to cover the cost of production. So it is basically in response to a pitch that we send is when we get an email back. We typically do not see these fees stated on their website. So it's not known to us when we're reaching out to them that there is a fee. There are a couple of shows that we have seen podcast pitch forms, and they do list that there is a fee. So specifically, I've seen that with John Lee Dumas. He hosts Entrepreneurs on Fire. And then Lori Harder hosts the Earn Your Happy podcast. Both of them charge fees, and they have those listed on their Google Doc. For the record, John Lee Dumas right now has $3,500 listed as his appearance fee. And Lori Harder has $10,000 listed as what guests will be subject to if they are chosen to be a guest. So pretty significant cost to being on those shows. Now, I have never gone through with it, so I don't know if at the end they actually charge you. I have to assume that they do. So there's that. Now, both of those shows have very large audiences, significant numbers of downloads, and also that fee is very hefty. So that's kind of one end of the spectrum in what we are seeing in terms of they're upfront on the front end when you want to be a guest. We're not always seeing that on the back end around disclosing to the audience that there is a financial relationship. So my ideal scenario for this is that we would know on the front end before we reach out to a host that there is a fee associated with being a guest. Fun story, a couple of years ago, we pitched, and I forget the name of the show, but we pitched a client. The host came back and said, yes, she'll be a great fit. You can basically take the next step by going here. And it was to a checkout page with no real mention of the fee. It was basically you went to the checkout page and that's where you saw there was a fee. And in order to move forward, you had to pay it. So I thought that was really interesting to slide it in there. But typically, we're just not seeing those fees listed on the front end unless there is some sort of form that states it. The fees that we are seeing literally range from, like I mentioned, $35 all the way up. Lori Harder's is the most that I've seen at $10,000. And I have mixed feelings on it because I'm like, if you're $35, like to me, if you're going to charge, right? Like make it worth your time, make it worth the transaction fee and setting up that financial transaction. But we've seen it. A lot of the ones recently that we've seen are in that $100 to $200 an episode fee. So typically I'm not seeing thousands of dollars, but they're in that 200 and under range. Now, what is our response then when we get these emails sent back to us sharing that they have this appearance fee? Well, I won't say it became so common, but it did become common enough that we created a canned email response that goes right back when hosts share that they have an appearance fee. So I'm reading it to you. Okay, my friend. So we have it saved inside of Gmail. The subject line doesn't actually go to the host, but we have it internally. We can see it. It's called the guesting fees reply. And it goes a little something like this. So, hi there. Thanks for letting us know there's an appearance fee. If you could send us the following information, we will pass it along to our client's name to see if it's a good fit for their advertising budget. Because, caveat, when you are charging, it really transitions this earned opportunity, this earned media opportunity into an advertising opportunity. So it is my belief that we need to have the same information you would have when you were choosing to advertise somewhere when we start exchanging dollars to get someone on a show. So that's the intro. And then the bullets that we share about the information that we would like to have is the total monthly downloads estimated over the last 3 months, 30-day download average for one episode. So roughly how many downloads is an episode getting every single month or within the first 30 days, how you'll share the episode, and the size of the audience on those platforms. So if you're sharing via email, how many subscribers do you have? If you're sharing on Instagram, how many followers do you have? The next bullet is the expected go live date for the interview. And then lastly, how the guesting/advertising fee will be disclosed to listeners. Because if this bullet, number 5, if it is a response that says we don't share this information with our listeners, or we haven't shared this information with our listeners in the past, it is a hard no on our end, because I do not want to participate in anything to where the listeners are left out of the conversation, to where they do not understand the financial flow of money going on behind the scenes. Because I view podcast guesting, me coming on someone else's show for an interview as an expert, it's really like that host is vouching for me. And as a listener, if I knew that the shows I listen to are paying, well, the guests are paying to be on there, it changes how I perceive that guest. It changes the level at which that host is really vouching for that guest, because in my mind, I'm like, well, they're just taking the money, right? Now, that said, I do have to assume the positive, and that these hosts who are accepting money or requiring money for their guests to come on are still vetting them as they typically would, and they are not just saying yes to anyone who's willing to fork over a couple $100. But I still think the listener needs to be a part of the conversation. And that, to me, you're not checking that box just by putting it on the Google form that's on your website, because your listener is very unlikely to go to the pitching form on your website. They are listening to the show on audio. So that needs to be shared with them in my mind. And we'll talk about this next week too with Gordon, but that also needs to be shared in audio. So those are the 5 bullets: total monthly downloads, 30-day download average for an episode, how they're going to share it, and the audience size of where they're sharing, expected go live date, and then how the listeners are getting this information disclosed to them. Then we say, once we get that info and hear back from Susie Q, our client, we will circle back with you. Thanks so much. And again, these are the questions we ask. There has been one time recently where someone was disclosing the information to their listeners, and it was basically saying, thank you to Susie Q, who sponsored this episode. We're so appreciative of her helping us to continue to produce great content, which to me, I think when you hear the word sponsored, you know it's paid for. So there's that. So feel free to copy that word for word and use that. If you are pitching yourself regularly, or if you're pitching clients regularly and you need not a comeback, you just need a response when you get hit with a media fee. Okay, so let's say you get all of that information. Well, when do you say yes to the opportunity? For me, it's really about balancing the size of the show, the information that they share with me around their size, and if that seems kind of aligned with the amount that they are asking to be paid, right? So there's that piece of it first. Is the show got enough listeners to make that amount of investment reasonable? I'd like to look at the demographics of the listener. Are they kind of my ideal client? Do they fall within the realm of who we tend to serve? If it is a business podcast, are they talking to an audience who is in the stage of business where they likely need your service? We also evaluate how niche the podcast is. So if they are talking to a very specific segment of business owners, I tend to love that, and I place more value in that because I do feel that those types of shows have more engaged audiences because they've by default cultivated a community. So I kind of take all of that, and I think you should too, and figure out how well aligned does this show seem to align with who I want to connect with, and then you can kind of decide. I also think it's important to have kind of a marker in your mind of how much you are spending and what the going rate is, right? So if we're comparing advertising rates, and in podcasts, you can go back to our episode with Heather Osgood about podcast advertising, but the way that you kind of calculate how much an ad spot would cost you is the average CPM. So the cost per mille, which is basically the cost of 1,000 impressions. In podcasting space, that's basically how much would you pay for 1,000 downloads of this ad spot. And I pulled the current pricing on CPM from AdvertiseCast. Currently, as of recording in March of 2023, a 30-second ad is going at a rate of about $18 per 1,000 downloads. And then a 60-second ad is going for about $25. So you can see already that 30 seconds and 60 seconds is a lot less time in front of an audience than an actual podcast interview. So of course, an interview is going to be priced higher than an ad spot because there's so much more that can come from an interview than just a blanket ad spot. But if you've got the information on downloads from the host or from using a variety of other sources, you can look at listen notes just to kind of get an idea of where that show ranks. Then you can start to compare the amount that you would be spending on a podcast interview versus the amount that you would be spending on an ad spot, and really starting to compare and having this threshold for deciding when you believe it's worth it. So for perspective, last year I ran an ad on Buzzsprout where I recorded a 45-second ad spot for the Go Pitch Yourself podcast, gave it to them, and then they distributed it among different shows that host their podcast on Buzzsprout, and they ran it a total of 5,000 downloads. So once that ad spot had been on shows that had downloads that totaled 5,000, they pulled it, and I paid $100 for that. So if we do the math on that, I basically was paying $20 CPM. So I paid $20 for 1,000 downloads, which ended up equaling $100 for 5,000. So again, it's really important if you're going to start paying for these opportunities to evaluate the monetary part of it critically, because it is an advertising budget at that point. So those are some things just to consider. And for me, I think it's also important to evaluate the longevity of the show, or really what you perceive to be the expected longevity of the show. There are a couple of podcasts that we have in our database that are marked with media fees so that we know they charge when we're searching to create a pitch list. And some of them are no longer active. So that would be real unfortunate if you paid money to be interviewed on a podcast and then a month later that podcast was no longer producing new content and growing their audience. So that's something you just have to kind of poke around, listen to their content a little bit, look at their engagement on social, and really get a sense of, do I think this host is going to stick around and stick with the podcast? So hopefully that will give you a little bit of insight into what to evaluate when you're deciding whether or not some of these paid opportunities make sense for you. Money aside, for me, the first and foremost question is whether or not they disclose. And if they don't, I'm out. I don't really want to be a part of that because I feel like it's deceptive in how they're treating their audience. So that's my 2 cents. It's probably worth a little bit more than 2 cents, hopefully. So as I mentioned, last year, we actually tested this out. So we pitched a client to a show. They came back with us and was like, we have this really amazing opportunity for you to partner with us. I forget the language that they used, but it was basically 2 tiers of support. One was $97. One was $197. I was like, let's just try it. It was a really niche show. It was in the tech space, women in tech space. And the client that we had, that was one of her core audiences and people that she served. So I thought, it seems fairly well aligned. I looked on LinkedIn. The host had a pretty decent following, 5,000 followers on LinkedIn. That's fairly significant. And so I thought, well, let's go for it, because within that $97, what it was supposed to include, let me pull it. I copied it exactly word for word. So within that $97 tier, you got the interview on the podcast. You can discuss whatever you wanted to, obviously like formatted into a conversation. And then the publicity of the show, the episode would be shared across Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And on LinkedIn, again, they had over 5,000 followers. They shared that they publicize heavily for the first 2 weeks, but then revisit the episode for 2 months. They share it to their exclusive private Slack channel of over 200 leaders. And they also share the episode with their email subscribers, which was around 800. So to me, that sounded like there was potential with it being such a niche audience. So we went for it. And what did we get out of it? So from an outward appearance, we have not really seen much impact from that interview at all. When I go and look on the different places that were publicly facing that were supposed to share the content, I saw 1 post per platform. None of those posts actually tagged our client to where they could have interacted with the post, with the followers, then they could have shared it. So that to me was a bit disappointing because I feel like it cut down on the reach that those posts could have ever had. There was one additional poll that I saw on LinkedIn that kind of referred back to the topic of the episode, but it didn't reference the show. It didn't reference our client, none of it. It was just kind of a poll sort of in that space. And even the host didn't really comment or engage on the post. I was definitely disappointed on that end. It's still only been a couple of weeks since that interview has gone live. So we're going to touch base with the client to get a feel for what sort of like longer term impact have they seen. But I will say I was disappointed with it. So that's something also to think about. This is one of those things where I didn't feel like going back to the host to kind of check in to see how this campaign might have been going, because I just got the sense that it wasn't something that was heavily paid attention to, that they were doing their due diligence to get, this episode out any more than they would have if, we hadn't been paying. So I just say that to have a little bit of caution going in, even when you've got this whole list of ways that the episode will be shared and what will be included. Don't automatically assume it's going to be a home run because you're paying money, right? So yeah, that was our experience of actually paying to play. So the last thing I want to talk about, and I'll say let's just mention it because I would like to cover this in an upcoming episode. There is conversation in the podcasting space and in any creator space about when is the money going to the creator, right? When is the podcast host actually getting money? And if you think about it in the podcast world, I mean, we get the money, right? The Podwize Group, when we take on a client, they are paying us to book their interviews. So we get money in the exchange. Typically, the host does not, but you have to assume or hope that the host has set up their show in a way to where they are making money of some sort. There have been some more novel approaches in the podcasting space to get money back in the hands of the podcaster. Podmatch is doing something pretty innovative. We'll dig into that in a future episode. And then I do think there are exchanges in different types of agencies to where when clients get booked as guests, there is an exchange of money. We do not do that, but I think it happens, right? And again, I'm not here to poo-poo the idea of making money. I think it all just needs to come with a bit of transparency and disclosure so that the listener, who is kind of like the end user, knows who has a vested interest in some of these episodes and in some of this content. So that's my basic gist on this. I would love to hear your thoughts, any questions that kind of came to you as I was rambling on about paying for podcast interviews. What's your take on you paying to be interviewed? Are you open to it? And has this kind of helped you figure out what are your criteria for saying yes, or is it just an automatic no? I would love to connect and hear from you. So when this episode goes live, I'm going to post over on LinkedIn with a couple of questions that I would love to get your feedback on in the comments. So please, as you are listening now, pop over to my LinkedIn. I'm at Angie Trueblood. Look for the post and then comment. I want to hear your feedback, my friend. And be sure to listen in 2 weeks from today as we're going to have Gordon Firemark on to talk about some of the legal implications of these types of financial relationships and the importance of disclosure. All right. Until then, my friend, be well and be visible. So much for listening to this episode of Go Pitch Yourself. If you found this episode to be helpful, friend, you would be blown away by what we can accomplish together. Here are 2 next best steps. 1, be sure to sign up for our bi-weekly newsletter. That is twice a month, if that term confuses you as much as it does me. Each week that our episodes drop, I send an action-focused email, including an insider tip of the week based on the work that we do behind the scenes in our client's business. For example, a recent tip of the week included how to estimate how large a podcast audience is. To get access to this exclusive content, pop on over to thepodwizegroup.com/pitches and sign up. As a special thank you, you'll get your first insider tip of the week as access to 6 pitches my team and I have sent that were accepted, including the core components of any great pitch. Number 2, schedule a call with me to figure out which of our services, if any, would be a good fit for you. We have a variety of ways to support you and your team in helping grow your business through podcast guesting, and I am pretty skilled at helping identify pain points and solutions. Hop over to thepodwizegroup.com/services and grab a spot on my calendar at the bottom of the page.